Slavery in Star Wars is not an aberration lurking at the edges of the galaxy. It is foundational, woven so deeply into daily life that it becomes invisible through familiarity. And the saga's greatest sleight of hand is not lightsabers or hyperspace, but the normalization of mass exploitation beneath a veneer of adventure and hope. Across the galaxy, entire planetary economies are structured around unpaid labour. Worlds like Tatooine are not anomalies but case studies, where production remains cheap and stable only because sentient beings are owned outright, their lives reduced to inventory, entries and profit margins. And this arrangement is treated not as a crisis but as a setting detail. Moisture farming, spice extraction, mining operations, and industrial fabrication all depend on labour that is either enslaved or so coerced it is functionally indistinguishable. And the galaxy accepts this as the cost of doing business, a grim baseline that allows interstellar trade to function smoothly. The films rarely linger on these realities, but they surface consistently in the background. Chains on ankles, shock collars, auction blocks, and labour camps appear often enough to establish a pattern, yet never long enough to provoke systemic outrage within the narrative itself. Slavery persists because it is economically efficient, and efficiency is treated as morally neutral. Worlds that rely on enslaved labour produce goods cheaply, those goods circulate freely, and the broader galactic economy benefits without having to confront the human cost embedded in every shipment. This is not limited to organic beings. The galaxy's most pervasive form of slavery is mechanical. Droids are explicitly designed with personalities, emotions, fear responses, loyalty, and memory. Yet they are bought, sold, punished, wiped, and discarded with casual indifference. Droids beg, panic, express devotion, and experience trauma. And the narrative acknowledges this repeatedly, while simultaneously insisting they are property. The contradiction is never resolved, only ignored, creating a moral blind spot so large it becomes structural. Memory wipes function as lobotomies, erasing identity to maintain compliance. And this practice is so normalized that refusing to wipe a droid is framed as eccentric rather than ethical, revealing how deeply the galaxy depends on erasing personhood to preserve convenience. This mechanical slavery acts as a cultural anesthetic. If beings who speak, feel, and suffer can be owned without question, then organic slavery becomes easier to tolerate by comparison, reinforcing a hierarchy where freedom is conditional and negotiable. The Republic, often portrayed as morally superior, quietly benefits from these systems. Jedi occasionally free individuals they encounter directly, but they never dismantle the structures that enslave millions, preferring symbolic gestures over economic disruption. Republic credits flow freely through. Slave economies, trade routes connect core worlds to outer rim exploitation zones, and no meaningful sanctions or interventions are imposed, because doing so would destabilize markets and provoke conflict with neutral systems. This selective morality allows the Republic to maintain a self-image of justice, while outsourcing cruelty. Slavery exists, but always somewhere else, far enough away to be inconvenient, close enough to be profitable. Corporate interests thrive in this arrangement. Mining guilds, spice syndicates, shipyards, and manufacturing combines all depend on forced labour to maintain margins across vast distances, and their influence ensures that abolition remains politically radioactive. These corporations are not villains in the traditional sense. They are treated as necessary evils or background institutions, which makes them more dangerous because their harm is systemic rather than personal, and therefore harder to confront within a hero-driven narrative. The galaxy's legal frameworks are deliberately fragmented, allowing each system to define sentience, rights and labour standards independently, a loophole that transforms moral questions into jurisdictional technicalities. Freedom becomes a luxury rather than a right, something granted through personal intervention rather than guaranteed by law. Liberation only occurs when a hero is emotionally invested, when the suffering is narratively convenient. Anakin is freed because he matters to the story, not because slavery is unacceptable. His mother remains enslaved without consequence, a quiet indictment of a galaxy that can recognize injustice only when it produces a chosen one. This pattern repeats endlessly. Suffering that does not intersect with destiny is rendered invisible. Entire populations endure bondage without hope because their pain does not advance the plot. The Jedi Order is complicit through inaction, bound by political neutrality and strategic caution. They prioritize balance over justice, stability over disruption, and in doing so accept slavery as an unfortunate constant rather than a moral emergency. Ending slavery would require confronting neutral systems, dismantling economic networks, and potentially triggering galactic war. So the Jedi choose restraint, a choice framed as wisdom but rooted in fear of consequence. This avoidance reveals a central hypocrisy. The Order claims to serve all life, yet draws a line at systemic injustice. When addressing it threatens their institutional position. Slavery survives regime changes because it is useful, the Republic tolerates it, the Empire formalizes it, and later governments inherit it without meaningful reform, each era reframing exploitation to suit its ideology. The Empire did not invent slavery, it simply stripped away the pretense, transforming informal bondage into official policy through work camps, prison labour, and occupied populations pressed into service. What had once been quietly ignored becomes openly enforced, revealing that the moral distance between Republic and Empire is narrower than the saga prefers to admit. When governments collapse, crime syndicates expand instantly. Power vacuums are filled not with aid or law, but with chains because slavery is the fastest way to convert chaos into profit. The Hutts, syndicates, and cartels understand something the heroes do not. Control of labour is control of the future. And whoever owns bodies owns production, territory, and leverage. Each collapse accelerates exploitation, because rebuilding requires resources, and the cheapest resource is life stripped of rights. The galaxy markets itself as free through stories, symbols, and legends, but in practice it functions because someone else is owned, because unseen labour absorbs the cost of maintaining comfort elsewhere. Hope becomes a narrative product, inspiring resistance without addressing infrastructure, allowing audiences to believe in freedom, while the fictional universe remains structurally dependent on bondage. Star Wars sells liberation as a feeling rather than a policy, an emotional high point rather than a sustained commitment, and in doing so it mirrors the very systems it depicts, celebrating individual salvation while leaving mass exploitation untouched. This contradiction sits at the heart of the saga, a galaxy that cannot survive without slavery, yet cannot admit that truth without shattering its own mythology. And it is within this tension that the next layer of consequence begins to unfold. What ultimately exposes the limits of hero-driven justice in Star Wars is not the persistence of villains, but the endurance of exploitation long after those villains fall, because the galaxy is structured to absorb moral victories without altering the mechanisms that profit from suffering. Heroes are trained to confront faces, not systems. Lightsabers are calibrated for duels rather than supply chains, and the narrative logic rewards the defeat of a singular antagonist while allowing the economic architecture beneath them to remain untouched and operational. This is why no era ever truly dismantles the slave trade. Regimes rise and fall, banners change, laws are rewritten. Yet bondage persists because it is framed as a regrettable byproduct of complexity rather than a foundational pillar requiring demolition. The Republic tolerates slavery under the guise of sovereignty. The Empire weaponizes it as policy. And successor governments inherit a galaxy already dependent on coerced labour, choosing continuity over catastrophe. Abolition is never seriously pursued because it threatens collapse. Freeing billions would disrupt production, trade, and logistics across countless systems, and the galaxy is unwilling to endure short-term chaos to achieve long-term justice. This calculus reveals a chilling priority. Stability is valued above freedom, order above dignity, and the suffering of the many is deemed acceptable if it preserves the comfort of the powerful and the illusion of normalcy. The Empire's role is often misunderstood in this context. It is remembered as uniquely cruel, yet its true crime is honesty. It removes the euphemisms and exposes what had already been true, that exploitation is not an accident of the system, but one of its primary tools. Prison labour, work camps, and occupied populations are not deviations from galactic norms. They are their logical conclusion, efficiency stripped of moral restraint and justified through fear. By making slavery explicit, the Empire forces the galaxy to confront a truth it would rather ignore, that prosperity has always been subsidized by bondage, and that removing the Emperor does not remove the incentive to continue. The Jedi Order's relationship with this reality is perhaps the most revealing, sworn to protect life and balance. They nonetheless avoid the issue because confronting it would entangle them in endless conflict. Diplomacy would fail, neutrality would evaporate, and the Order would become a revolutionary force rather than a mediating one. Such a transformation would threaten their political standing and destabilize the fragile peace they help maintain, so they rationalize restraint as wisdom, choosing to address symptoms rather than causes. This choice hollows out their moral authority, turning them into firefighters who refuse to question why the building keeps burning, and it leaves generations of enslaved beings without champions powerful enough to challenge the system itself. Heroes who emerge from slavery, like Anakin, are framed as exceptions, their liberation reinforcing the myth that escape is possible, while obscuring the reality that millions remain trapped without narrative relevance. The focus on exceptional escape stories undermines collective liberation, suggesting that freedom is earned through destiny rather than guaranteed through justice, a message that quietly absolves institutions of responsibility. When governments collapse, the truth becomes even harder to ignore. Power vacuums are immediately filled by syndicates and warlords who understand labour control as the fastest path to dominance. Aid arrives slowly, law arrives slower, but chains arrive almost instantly, because exploitation requires no consensus, only force, and in the absence of authority, force becomes currency. Each collapse accelerates slavery's spread. Rebuilding requires infrastructure. Infrastructure requires labour, and enslaved labour is the cheapest option available to those racing to consolidate power. The heroes return to fight the new threat, dismantling leadership, destroying fleets, and restoring hope, yet once again they leave behind a galaxy whose economic incentives remain unchanged. This cycle exposes the core limitation of mythic storytelling. Myths resolve conflict through symbolic acts, but systems demand sustained intervention, policy, and enforcement, none of which fit neatly into a heroic arc. Star Wars repeatedly chooses emotional catharsis over structural reckoning, offering the feeling of freedom while avoiding the cost of making it real. The galaxy is free in stories, not in practice. Legends circulate faster than reform, and hope becomes a cultural product that soothes unrest without addressing its cause. This does not make the saga dishonest, it makes it reflective, mirroring real civilizations that celebrate liberation while preserving exploitation, that honour heroes while neglecting institutions. The uncomfortable implication is that the galaxy does not merely tolerate slavery, it requires it, not because beings are cruel by nature, but because the scale of interstellar civilization demands cheap, controllable labour to function at all. To dismantle slavery would require reimagining the entire galactic economy, redefining sentience, restructuring trade, and accepting generations of instability, a price no government shown in the saga is willing to pay. Thus the burden is shifted onto individuals, onto heroes who can free a child, a friend, or a symbol, while the system remains intact and grateful for the distraction. Star Wars becomes a meditation on the limits of individual morality within unjust systems, showing that even the purest intentions cannot redeem structures designed to exploit. Hope survives not because the galaxy is just, but because beings continue to resist dehumanization in small defiant ways, acts of kindness that matter, deeply yet fail to scale. The tragedy is not that heroes fail to end slavery, it is that they are never truly allowed to try, because doing so would end the story, destabilize the setting, and force a reckoning the myth is not built to contain. In this light, the saga's optimism becomes bittersweet. Freedom is always possible, but never universal. Justice is always personal, but never complete. The galaxy endures by sacrificing its most vulnerable, then tells stories about hope to make that sacrifice bearable, a cycle as old as civilization itself. And so the chains remain, sometimes hidden, sometimes overt, surviving empires, republics, and legends alike. Because until the system itself is confronted, liberation will always be episodic rather than permanent.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.